Bumbutai was born in 1613 into the powerful Borjigit clan of the Cochin Mongols, a lineage tied by blood to the legacy of Genghis Khan. Her early life unfolded on the steppes of northeastern Asia, where tribal politics was shaped by fragile alliances with the rising Jurchen state to the east and the declining Ming Empire to the south. At the time, the Cochin held a strategic position as both buffer and bridge, negotiating loyalty and survival between the old imperial world and the emerging forces that sought to replace it. Her clan aligned with the growing power of Nurhaci, founder of the latter Jin, which would soon become the Qing Dynasty. In this alliance, marriages were not personal bonds, but instruments of diplomacy. When Bumbutai was still a teenager, she was selected to be sent as a consort to Nurhaci's son, Hong Taiji, the man who would become emperor and transform the Jurchen into the ruling class of a new dynasty. She left her homeland not as a daughter, but as a gesture of submission from her tribe to the rising imperial order. Her arrival in Mukden, the Manchu capital, marked a quiet crossing into an alien world. She spoke Mongolian, not Manchu. She wore the heritage of a steppe queen, not a palace consort. But the imperial court she entered was already in flux, its language shifting, its rituals still being invented, its enemies encircling from every direction. As one of many consorts, her role was neither central nor secure. She bore the title of secondary consort, subordinate to senior wives, with no immediate claim to influence. Yet her presence represented more than a personal union. She was the living thread between the Mongol elite and the Manchu state, a diplomatic hostage, a cultural bridge, and a potential conduit of power. Her status offered no protection, only proximity. But proximity to the throne, in volatile times, was its own kind of leverage. Bumbutai observed as Hong Taiji consolidated the fragments of Nurhaci's conquests and slowly replaced Jurchen tribal identity with a new dynastic vision. The transition from the later Jin to the Qing, declared in 1636, required not just military strength, but symbolic legitimacy. It was no coincidence that this same year, Bumbutai gave birth to her only son, Fulin, the child who would eventually become the Shunzhi emperor. In the intricate politics of succession, her position shifted. She was no longer just a consort. She was now the mother of a potential heir. But power in the Manchu court was not passed through bloodlines alone. It was filtered through councils, regents, generals, and competing branches of the ruling clan. In this environment, a mother could be both revered and discarded, depending on the court's needs. Bumbutai did not act out or make declarations. She remained quiet, calculating, watching how others wielded influence and how quickly favor turned to exile. The external world mirrored this instability. The Ming dynasty, weakened by internal decay and external pressure, collapsed in 1644 as peasant rebellions overwhelmed the imperial heartland. Li Ziqing's short-lived Shun dynasty filled the vacuum in Beijing before the Qing marched through the Great Wall with the help of defected Ming general Wu Sangui. It was a conquest accelerated by chaos, but behind it stood years of positioning and negotiation. Bumbutai, now deep within the Manchu court, bore witness to these events, not from a battlefield, but from the still, listening center of the palace. She understood what the collapse of the Ming meant, not just for China, but for the world her son would inherit. The rules of dynastic legitimacy had been rewritten, and she had seen which names survived each purge, which generals switched allegiance, and which families were destroyed without leaving records. As the Qing claimed the mandate of heaven, establishing themselves as rightful successors to the Ming, the court turned inward to decide how this new empire would be governed and by whom. Hong Taiji died in 1643 without formally naming a successor. Fulin, Bumbutai's son, was only 5 years old. In the power vacuum that followed, the court split into rival factions, and the regency of Prince Dorgon was declared to rule on behalf of the boy emperor. Through it all, Bumbutai remained outwardly compliant, saying little, moving carefully, never contradicting the regents, never asserting herself. But her silence was not absence. It was strategy. Every turn of court favor, every punishment doled out to a concubine, every reshuffling of ministries she absorbed. Her mind became a ledger of political debts, a quiet record of ambition and fear. She had grown up watching Mongol alliances fracture under pressure, and now watched Manchu authority slowly harden into bureaucracy. She saw the balance shift from tribal identity to imperial structure, from battlefield rule to administrative power. Her personal identity, once tied to the steppes, was now fused to a throne her son could barely hold, and a court that viewed women as ornamental at best, disposable at worst. But she endured, while others fell. Ministers accused of treason, generals exiled, concubines forgotten, she remained. Not by force, not by decree, but by understanding how history moved and staying just behind its shoulder. Bumbutai entered the court of Hong Taiji not as a queen, but as a secondary consort, a young woman with no power of her own and no command of the Manchu language. The world she stepped into was ruled not by shared culture, but by competing agendas. The palace in Mukden, while smaller than later imperial complexes, was already a place of hierarchy, whisper networks, and brittle protocol. The Manchu elite were defining themselves in contrast to the Han they would one day rule, and to the Mongols they had once feared. In that space, Bumbutai's Mongol blood made her a useful symbol, but a potential threat. She represented a nomadic power that had once ruled the Chinese world. A reminder of history the Manchu leaders respected, but also sought to eclipse. Her presence was political, not personal, and her movements were watched. She arrived with her cousin, Zherzher, who became Hong Taiji's primary wife and empress. This left Bumbutai in a delicate position, close to the throne by kinship and motherhood, yet always behind another woman in status. She responded to the unspoken threat, not with resistance, but with observation. While other women in the harem navigated the court through beauty or rumor, Bumbutai turned inward, studying the structure around her. She learned the Manchu language gradually, not just for communication, but for comprehension, to understand the documents, edicts, and titles that dictated power. She listened in silence during ceremonies, tracing who stood where, who was allowed to speak, and who was not called at all. The court of Hong Taiji was still in formation, transitioning from tribal governance into imperial order. Titles shifted, military roles hardened, and alliances once made on horseback were now ratified with seals and rituals. Bumbutai watched this evolution without drawing attention. Her ability to remain present and overlooked gave her space to learn what others exposed in ambition. As Hong Taiji pushed his campaigns further into Ming territory and centralized the Qing court structure, He reorganized ranks, established administrative boards, and issued laws meant to solidify the dynasty's identity. In this process, the palace became an extension of the state. Every concubine, eunuch, and attendant part of a larger machinery of rule. Bumbutai, though not empress, rose in favor because she did not challenge the order, yet quietly embodied its needs. She bore Hong Taiji a son, Fulin, in 1638, further stabilizing her position. The birth of a male heir, especially at a time when succession was unsettled, changed her standing without needing ceremony. She became indispensable, not by title, but by bloodline. In a court where power was often temporary and proximity could shift with a single death, motherhood became her strongest shield. But it was not only through her son that she secured influence. Over time, she built quiet relationships with court officials, retainers, and other women, not to command them, but to know where they stood. She understood that favor from the emperor could be revoked, but knowledge of where loyalty sat was harder to erase. The palace, like the wider empire, was stitched together by fragile connections. Bumbutai focused not on leading, but on remaining. Her survival was built on not threatening those who outranked her, while slowly becoming essential to those who protected the child she had borne. In doing so, she wove herself into the palace's inner fabric, not visibly, but thoroughly. The years leading up to Hong Taiji's death were marked by military expansion and ideological shift. He declared the name of the new dynasty, Qing, and adopted imperial Chinese models of bureaucracy to legitimize rule over Han territories. It was during this shift that Bumbutai deepened her transformation from foreign bride to embedded court figure. Her knowledge of multiple cultures, Mongol, Manchu, and increasingly Han, gave her a kind of unspoken flexibility. She could interpret between customs without appearing to violate any of them. Her silence was not passive. It was calculated. In a court shaped by conflict and uneasy consolidation, the woman who spoke least often carried the least risk, and yet saw the most. By the time her son had reached toddlerhood, she was no longer simply the consort of a Khan. She had become a mother to the dynasty's future, a fluent observer of a court not her own, and a woman who would outlive most of the men whose power she had studied in silence. When Hong Taiji died, without naming a successor in 1643, the Qing court faced its first great crisis of legitimacy. The dynasty was still young, its institutions fragile, and the power that held it together had been concentrated in a single man. His sudden death left a vacuum, and into that space poured ambition, fear, and calculation. The court split into factions, each maneuvering for control over the future. There were those who supported Hong Taiji's eldest son, Ugi, citing age and lineage, while others backed Dorgon, Hong Taiji's half-brother, and a commanding military figure with real influence. In the end, a compromise was reached, not through consensus, but through exhaustion and fear of collapse. The throne was given to Fulin, Bumbutai's 5-year-old son, and the regency was handed to Dorgon. It was a solution that calmed no one, least of all the mother of the boy emperor. As the consort of a deceased emperor and mother to his young heir, Bumbutai, now styled Empress Dowager Xiaozhuang, should have been elevated to symbolic prominence. But widowhood in the Qing court was a delicate condition. Imperial widows, especially those without formal empress status, were expected to retreat from politics and disappear into ritual mourning. Xiaozhuang did not protest. She adopted the language of withdrawal, dressed in appropriate mourning robes, and performed every ceremonial expectation. But beneath the surface, she was calculating every move. She knew her son's crown was not his own. It rested in Dorgon's hands, a man known for both brilliance and brutality. She also knew that if she misstepped, she and Fulin could be quietly removed from history, their names replaced by more convenient heirs. Her position required something more complex than influence. It required invisibility. She never openly challenged Dorgon, never interfered with court decisions, and never asked for authority. Instead, she became indispensable in subtler ways. She cultivated a personal image of devotion and humility, attending rituals with care, maintaining strict propriety, and offering no opinions in public. But in private, she positioned herself as the only stable presence in the boy emperor's life. As the court reshuffled around Regency politics, she made herself the constant. Ministers changed, factions rose and fell, but Xiaozhuang remained at Fulin's side, the one figure he trusted implicitly. That emotional bond became political leverage. It ensured she could shape his perceptions, even if she could not yet shape his decisions. She also paid close attention to the court's inner rhythms. She kept track of which ministers whispered to which regents, who deferred too quickly to Dorgon, and who still carried doubts about the dynasty's future. She sent no spies, made no accusations, but remembered everything. In a world where power flowed through memory and silence, hers became a dangerous kind. The palace itself was a battlefield of another sort, filled with concubines, eunuchs, and staff aligned with various factions. Xiaozhuang offered no resistance to these networks. Instead, she offered grace. She greeted enemies with composure, allowed their relatives to remain in posts, and praised those who sought her son's well-being. Her hospitality disarmed more than any edict could. She made herself unthreatening, and in doing so, began to erode the perception that she needed to be watched. Outside the palace, the Qing continued its consolidation over China proper. In 1644, the Ming capital of Beijing fell, and Dorgon led the Qing armies through the gates with the help of defected Ming general Wu Sangui. The Qing declared themselves heirs to the mandate of heaven, and Fulin, the Shunzhi emperor, was installed in the Forbidden City. Xiaozhuang moved with him. She entered the heart of Chinese civilization, not as a ruler, not even as an empress, but as a widow whose child sat on a throne shaped by war and compromise. The palace in Beijing brought new risks, new enemies, and deeper traditions that viewed female authority with suspicion. But she had already learned how to survive in a court that demanded her disappearance. She had no formal role in government, no army, no seal. But she had access. She had the child emperor's ear, and she understood how power worked. Not in proclamations, but in the spaces between them. As the Shunzhi emperor grew into adolescence, his reign remained shaped by the regency that had placed him on the throne. Though the Qing court issued edicts in his name, real authority still belonged to Prince Dorgon, whose military victories and administrative control made him the de facto ruler of the empire. In this environment, Empress Dowager Xiaozhuang walked a razor's edge. Her son looked increasingly to her for counsel, not as a mother alone, but as the only figure in his life who had remained constant during years of political turbulence. In the privacy of palace halls, where no memorials were filed and no ministers watched, she helped him interpret the language of power. She taught him which silences mattered, how to recognize a loyal gesture, and when to retreat in order to survive. To those outside their chambers, her influence was invisible, but within the court, suspicion fermented. Whispered accusations emerged that the boy emperor's mind was not his own, that his mother moved his hand beneath the imperial seal. Dorgon's regency became increasingly intolerant of autonomy. He issued orders in the emperor's name and reshaped court protocol to centralize his own authority. In public ceremonies, he appeared as near equal to the emperor, and in matters of military and civil appointments, his word remained final. Some in the court saw this as efficient governance. Others saw it as usurpation. Xiaozhuang remained outwardly neutral. She offered no rebuke to Dorgon's power, nor did she interfere with his reforms. But behind palace walls, she remained vigilant. Her son was no longer a child, and with each passing year, the question of when and how he would reclaim full control became more urgent. She understood that open confrontation would destroy them both. Instead, she focused on quiet containment. She ensured her son's tutors were loyal to the crown rather than the regent. She encouraged his study of Han governance, Confucian ideals, and dynastic history. Knowledge, she believed, was the only weapon that would not be seen as rebellion. But her proximity to both emperor and regent made her a target. Rumors spread that she and Dorgon shared more than political alignment, that their coordination hinted at personal entanglement. There is no record to confirm or deny such claims, but the very existence of the whispers was enough to undermine her credibility. In a court built on reputation, scandal had weight even when it lacked proof. Her every gesture was dissected. A shared glance at court, a decision not to oppose a decree, an imperial visit extended a day too long. Each became fuel for speculation. Xiaozhuang did not defend herself. She had seen how even innocence could be twisted to ambition. Instead, she became more restrained, withdrawing from court events and allowing Dorgon to appear unchallenged, even as she worked behind the scenes to ensure her son would not remain a ceremonial figurehead. When Dorgon died suddenly in 1650, the balance of power shifted overnight, with no clear successor to the regency and no military challenger strong enough to oppose the throne. The Shunzhi emperor declared himself sole ruler. He moved quickly to dismantle Dorgon's legacy, stripping him of titles, erasing honors, and accusing him posthumously of crimes against the state. Xiaozhuang did not interfere. She allowed her son to take the reins and watched as those who once pledged themselves to Dorgon now bent knee to the emperor they had underestimated. But her son's assumption of power did not free her from scrutiny. If anything, it made her more dangerous in the eyes of the court. Many believed she had orchestrated the entire transition, using the emperor's youth as cover for her own rule. Ministers now questioned whether the dowager's wisdom had become command. Xiaozhuang understood that at this level of power, there were no gestures without consequence. Every appointment was a calculation, every alliance a liability. She began to retreat from direct involvement in state affairs, not because her influence waned, but because she knew its value was now in absence. The emperor now ruling in his own right, still turned to her for counsel. But that counsel came in private, behind the lacquered doors of the inner court. She had learned that even loyalty bore risk, that even truth could be weaponized. Her experience with regents had taught her not only the price of visible power, but the advantage of being underestimated. She would not risk her son's reign by becoming its visible architect. Instead, she became its shadow, quiet, constant, and impossible to dislodge. In the early years of his personal rule, the Shunzhi emperor appeared eager to distinguish his reign from the regency that preceded it. He dismissed ministers associated with Dorgon, implemented reforms meant to ease tensions with the Han majority, and sought to fashion a court that reflected his own temperament rather than inherited loyalties. But beneath this assertiveness was a restlessness that found its expression not only in policy, but in forbidden intimacy. Among the women of the imperial harem was a Han Chinese consort, known in court records as Consort Dongo. She was not of Manchu origin, and by the customs that underpinned Qing court hierarchy, this alone made her presence controversial. The Qing leadership, still consolidating power after the conquest of China proper, enforced strict ethnic divisions within the palace. Han women were rarely elevated, and the notion that one might become empress was politically dangerous. Yet the emperor's attachment to her deepened beyond what custom allowed. Despite opposition from high-ranking officials and members of the imperial family, he arranged a formal marriage and sought to elevate her to the rank of empress. This decision, though framed as a personal act, had broader implications. It violated the unspoken rule that Manchu dominance, both politically and symbolically, must remain visible at all levels of court life. The appointment of a Han woman as empress challenged the ideological foundation of Qing legitimacy. Ministers warned that such favoritism endangered the delicate balance of ethnic rule, but the emperor dismissed them. He was not interested in abstract doctrine. He was consumed by private devotion. For Xiaozhuang, this moment marked a turning point. She had guided her son through political storms and court intrigues, but this was different. This was emotion unbound by strategy, personal grief masquerading as governance. She did not publicly oppose the emperor's choice, but within the court she worked to calm the backlash. She reassured officials that the emperor's devotion would not alter state policy, and reminded conservative voices that the dynasty's stability rested on flexibility, not dogma. Yet she knew the danger. The court was watching for signs that the emperor, like his regent before him, might allow personal obsession to overtake state responsibility. Her son's love had not only crossed ethnic boundaries, it had pierced the armor of imperial distance that a ruler was expected to maintain. The true crisis came not with the marriage, but with its sudden end. In 1660, Consort Dongo died after a short illness, leaving the emperor devastated. His grief was immediate and consuming. He withdrew from court affairs, neglected rituals, and fell into patterns of emotional instability that alarmed his advisors. He turned increasingly to Buddhist and Taoist mystics, seeking communion with the dead, and in doing so, distanced himself from the administrative core of his reign. Xiaozhuang attempted to re-establish normalcy, encouraging the emperor to resume his duties and surround himself with familiar court figures. But her words reached a man who no longer trusted the world around him. The loss of his consort had shattered something more than a relationship. It had fractured his sense of authority. For the court, this emotional retreat created a vacuum. Ministers began to reassert influence, competing factions gained ground, and policies once driven by imperial will now moved through cautious compromise. Xiaozhuang recognized these shifts as more than temporary disorder. She had seen how grief, when unchecked, could corrode the foundations of rule. Her son's mourning became a mirror for the fragility of the Qing court itself, a system that, for all its military might and bureaucratic strength, remained vulnerable to the inner lives of the people who led it. The dynasty had survived conquest, regency, and factionalism, but now it faced something more elusive: a ruler consumed by absence, and a mother forced to watch the empire bend under the weight of private sorrow. The Shunzhi emperor died in 1661 at the age of 22, a sudden departure that left the Qing court reeling. Officially, his death was attributed to smallpox, a disease that had long haunted both the Manchu and Han populations. Unofficially, rumors persisted of emotional collapse and spiritual retreat following the loss of his beloved consort. Whatever the cause, his passing created a crisis of succession at a fragile moment in the dynasty's early consolidation. The empire was not yet secure. Its borders still trembled with unrest, and its bureaucracy, though growing in sophistication, depended on a central figure to project continuity. In the absence of an adult heir, the court looked to the emperor's sons. It was Empress Dowager Xiaozhuang who moved first, selecting her grandson, Xuanye, only 8 years old, to ascend the throne. This was not a decision made lightly. Other sons, older and with clearer ties to court factions, could have been chosen to appease rival powers. But Xiaozhuang had seen what happened when regents were given free rein over older boys. She had lived it with her own son. In choosing Xuanye, she ensured that the child would be too young to rule, and thus she could shape the court's direction without visible defiance. The Qing ministers convened to approve the succession, and a four-man regency was installed to oversee state affairs. Yet those regents, powerful in name, quickly found themselves operating under Xiaozhuang's watchful eye. She held no formal position within the state structure, but her presence eclipsed every appointment. In the inner court, she was the final word. Through subtle gestures and private audiences, she managed the balance of power without appearing to claim it. Her command over the court was structured not through proclamations, but through systems of control. She carefully approved Xuanye's education, selecting tutors not only for their knowledge, but for their political neutrality. She scrutinized court memorials before they reached the regents. She monitored military commanders and rewarded loyalty with silence rather than favor. Her style was deliberate, almost cold. Those who had underestimated her in earlier years now found themselves marginalized, their access to the boy emperor tightly controlled. The regents, though respected by name, were isolated from one another by design. Xiaozhuang understood the value of separation. It prevented alliances and ensured that no single voice could challenge the throne's direction. Outside the Forbidden City, the empire continued to evolve. Han resistance simmered in the south, where remnants of the Ming loyalists still inspired rebellion. In the north, administrative reforms were expanding the Qing's reach into Han territory, but tensions over land, taxation, and language remained sharp. In this climate, A unified court was essential. Xiaozhuang maintained that unity not by inviting consensus, but by eliminating uncertainty. She discouraged open debate, favored bureaucratic efficiency, and emphasized ritual order. Her authority remained informal but incontestable. Even those who disliked her methods admitted her discipline held the dynasty together. For the young emperor, the world was shaped entirely within her framework. He was taught to speak when spoken to observe before commanding, and to carry the burden of rule as a weight rather than a privilege. Xiaozhuang did not indulge his youth. She guarded him from the instability she had once endured and prepared him to outgrow the role of figurehead. Her approach was not tender, but it was protective. In private, she monitored his growth, not just in knowledge, but in instinct. She wanted a ruler who could read the court, not be read by it. Her influence over him was complete, but it was never sentimental. She had seen what sentiment did to rulers. This time, she would not leave the outcome to chance. Xuanye, the child emperor chosen by Xiaozhuang in the wake of her son's death, came of age in a court still defined by tension, ritual, and factional scars. As he grew into adolescence, he entered a palace world not entirely his own, molded by regents who held ceremonial authority and by a grandmother who held something far more enduring, control over the spaces they could not see. By the time he neared his teenage years, the boy who would become the Kangxi emperor had absorbed the tools of survival that Xiaozhuang had quietly embedded in his life from the moment he first sat on the throne. He learned to observe without reacting, to listen before ruling, and to make obedience a mask behind which decisions could safely take shape. Xiaozhuang remained the presence behind these lessons, shaping his education not just with books and tutors, but with daily examples of restraint and timing. She understood that a boy in his position could not afford the indulgences of childhood. The four regents who had been entrusted to guide his reign were no longer unified. Their ambitions drifted in separate directions, their loyalty to the throne conditional at best. Of the four, Oboy emerged as the most aggressive, a man whose military background and rigid conservatism made him both powerful and unpredictable. He surrounded himself with allies, resisted reforms, and exercised court authority in a way that increasingly disregarded the emperor's presence. Xiaozhuang did not react with confrontation. Instead, she prepared Xuanye with precision. She did not teach him to oppose Oboy through open rebellion, but to wait, to gather support silently, and to learn the rhythm of the regent's moves until the court itself would be ready to accept his removal. At 16, Xuanye acted. With backing quietly assembled from key officials and palace guards, most of whom Xiaozhuang had previously vetted or shielded, he had Oboy arrested and stripped of power. The removal was swift, legal, and decisive. From that moment forward, the Kangxi emperor began to govern in his own right. Xiaozhuang did not step forward to claim credit. She receded further into the background, her role seemingly fulfilled. But behind his every move, her fingerprints remained. She had not raised a ruler by force, she had raised him by discipline. She had taught him to respect Confucian doctrine without being imprisoned by it, to lead with formality that concealed intent, and to tolerate the burdens of sovereignty with the cold patience of someone who had endured what lay beneath it. As Kangxi matured into one of the most capable emperors in Chinese history, he relied on Xiaozhuang less for instruction and more for reflection. She did not issue orders, but he often sought her counsel in the quiet spaces beyond the throne room. She watched his campaigns against Ming loyalists, his handling of flood relief, his navigation of Western missionaries at court. She recognized the ruler he had become, strong, measured, curious, and knew that much of what he was, she had shaped. But she also saw the cost. Her own life had narrowed to corridors of ritual and caution. She had buried her son, controlled her grandson's childhood, and spent decades holding together a dynasty still seen by many as foreign. There was no ceremony that repaid such work, no title that eased the silence she had kept. In the palace, she remained revered but rarely seen. Kangxi honored her publicly, bestowed her with titles of highest esteem, and credited her with the stability of his reign. Yet Xiaozhuang knew that power, once given away, did not return, and that her final years would be spent not in command, but in quiet observation of what she had helped preserve. The court no longer trembled as it once had, but she still watched it with care, knowing that stability was never a gift. It was the result of countless moments of restraint, of withheld ambition, and of trust built not on affection, but on the discipline of survival. The early years of the Kangxi Emperor's rule, though marked by youth and ceremony, were defined by shadow conflicts far from public view. When Xuanye had first ascended the throne at 8 years old, 4 senior officials were appointed to serve as regents, entrusted with safeguarding the empire until the boy came of age. These men, Suksaha, Sonin, Ebilun, and Oboy, were veterans of the early Qing conquest, respected for their loyalty to the dynasty and their administrative strength. But within a few short years, their shared responsibility devolved into private ambition. Sonin's death in 1667 fractured the balance, and Oboy began to move with unchecked authority. He manipulated court appointments, silenced dissenting voices, and positioned himself as the singular voice of imperial interpretation. It was a slow but deliberate consolidation that threatened not only Kangxi's sovereignty, but the dynasty's stability. Xiaozhuang, ever present but rarely seen, recognized the danger long before it reached the court record. She had spent her life watching men like Oboy rise under the guise of service. She did not advise open confrontation. She counseled patience. Kangxi, still in his teens, followed her direction with quiet discipline. Over time, allies were identified not by their declarations, but by their silences. Palace guards were rotated, secretaries were replaced, trusted officials were granted new assignments close to the emperor's daily routine. The imperial household began to shift without fanfare, and Oboy, confident in his command, did not notice that the very structure he relied upon had started to turn. In 1669, with the plan fully set, Kangxi ordered Oboy's arrest. The court obeyed without resistance. The removal of Oboy was not an act of rage or rebellion. It was a methodical neutralization of internal threat. Xiaozhuang ensured the aftermath was equally controlled. Oboy was accused of multiple crimes, stripped of all titles, and imprisoned. His fall served as a signal to the other regents and to the broader court that the emperor's authority was no longer symbolic. The other former regents, Suksaha and Ebilun, were handled differently. Suksaha was charged with corruption and executed. Ebilun was sidelined and quietly removed from decision-making roles. None of these actions were spontaneous. Each was calculated to remove opposition without destabilizing the fragile administrative hierarchy. The imperial court remained outwardly calm, but behind every verdict was a lesson in power management, one Xiaozhuang had refined over decades. This series of removals marked the final phase of the Regency era and the beginning of Kangxi's independent rule. It also solidified Xiaozhuang's legacy, not as a ruler in name, but as a master of palace strategy. She had raised a boy to become emperor, and now she ensured that no man could rule through him. Her influence during these years never appeared in memorials, but it was felt in every appointment approved, every demotion justified, every silence preserved. The dynasty's continued hold over China, still fresh in its conquest of the Han heartland, depended on this internal unity. Without it, rebellion would find footholds in divided leadership. Xiaozhuang's methods were never warm. Her choices did not reflect personal sentiment. Each move she made, from arranging court marriages to evaluating provincial governors, served the singular purpose of securing the throne her family had taken by force and now held by vigilance. She understood that mercy could be mistaken for weakness, and that political betrayal required not reconciliation, but removal. The Qing court, in these years, became less a site of open debate and more a system of controlled function. And it survived because the chaos of ambition was kept under silent guard. Her hand was never seen, but it never faltered. Xiaozhuang's presence in the Qing court spanned more than 5 decades, her influence stretching quietly across the reigns of 3 emperors. Though she never formally bore the title of Empress Dowager at the beginning, and never ruled as regent in name, she shaped the course of the dynasty with a kind of authority that operated outside the recorded proclamations of power. Her decisions did not echo in edicts, but in the outcomes that followed them. She never commanded armies, yet military campaigns unfolded under rulers she had trained. She never wore the yellow robes of sovereign status, yet in every crisis, the court turned toward her for stability. In a world where female power was tolerated only in silence or shadow, she had mastered both and endured beyond the rise and fall of the men who had once outranked her. Her role was never ceremonial. After the death of Hong Taiji, she had become the unseen architect of survival. She navigated her son Fulin through a court divided by regency, rebellion, and conquest. After his death, she secured the throne for his young son and spent the next decade fortifying the boy's mind, his court, and his future. Kangxi's reign would eventually be remembered as one of China's longest and most prosperous, but it had been seeded by her restraint and protected by her methods. Even as Kangxi matured into one of the most capable emperors in Chinese history, she remained a figure of intimate counsel and quiet discipline. Her authority came not from title, but from permanence. Others arrived with mandates and departed with disgrace or death. Xiaozhuang remained, but behind her endurance was a solitude that deepened with time. She had entered the court as a teenage bride, spoken a foreign tongue to survive, and given birth to a child she would one day bury. She watched as her husband was claimed by sudden illness, and her son by spiritual grief and early death. She had guided her grandson through a labyrinth of betrayal, only to watch the court shift again as new ministers replaced old enemies. Her friends had vanished one by one, some exiled, some executed, many simply forgotten by time. The palace, once full of ceremony and whispering corridors, became quieter with each passing year. Rituals were performed in her honor, but rarely did they reflect the weight of her memory. She had lived through every turning point of the early Qing Dynasty, yet she was increasingly alone in remembering them. Her rooms in the Forbidden City became more sparse as she aged. She withdrew from public life, not in disgrace, but in exhaustion. There were no longer battles to fight, only a dynasty to observe as it stretched into the future she had prepared. When Kangxi came to consult her, it was out of respect, not dependence. She offered advice only when asked, knowing that her power had already done its work. But she carried a kind of private grief, not only for those she had lost, but for the part of herself that had never been visible. She had never been empress, never ruled by decree, and never spoken her mind without calculation. Her entire life had been composed of watching, steering, and surviving. And in surviving, she had become irreplaceable. The dynasty owed her everything, though few within it would say so aloud. Empress Dowager Xiaozhuang died in 1688 at the age of 75, having outlived her husband, her son, and nearly every architect of the dynasty's earliest foundations. Her passing was unmarked by upheaval or drama. An event mourned with ceremony, but not crisis. The empire she had spent her life holding together did not tremble in her absence. That in itself was a sign of her success. The Kangxi emperor, then in the middle years of his long and celebrated reign, carried out her funeral rites with the gravity due to the woman who had raised him, guided him, and made his rule possible. But beyond the rituals and titles, the truth of her legacy was not contained in marble or silk. It lived in the institutions she had fortified, the crises she had diffused, and the discipline she had embedded into the throne itself. She had not ruled with an iron will. She had ruled with endurance and with an understanding of power as something to be channeled, not declared. Her death closed a chapter of the Qing dynasty's formation that few understood while it unfolded. Xiaozhuang had never been a general, never penned a law, never stood at the head of a formal court, but her fingerprints were on every key decision that defined the early dynasty. When Hong Taiji restructured the Manchu identity into a dynastic one, she watched and learned what made a name endure. When her son Shunzhi fell into spiritual despair, she steadied the court without undermining the throne. When her grandson faced down regents who threatened to eclipse him, she gave him the tools to dismantle them quietly. She never asked for credit. She knew history often forgets the quiet architects. But she built anyway, not for glory, but for survival. And that survival, from step alliance to imperial dominance, became the foundation upon which the Qing would rule for over 2 centuries. Her most enduring achievement was not simply the preservation of power, but the creation of a model of rule that merged cultures without shattering either. The Qing dynasty was born out of conquest, Manchus overtaking the Ming, but it was stabilized through compromise. Xiaozhuang understood this tension better than anyone. A Mongol by birth, a Manchu by marriage, and a ruler over Han majority subjects, she lived the fault lines of the empire daily. She ensured that Han bureaucratic traditions were preserved even as Manchu supremacy was maintained in ritual and law. She supported the integration of Confucian ideals into the court without surrendering Manchu identity. She tolerated Han concubines in the palace, but defended the ethnic boundaries of empress titles. She promoted Confucian education for the emperors she raised, knowing that governing China required more than conquest. It required legitimacy, and legitimacy in China came through cultural fluency, not tribal victory. She also grasped the importance of restraint in a system built on surveillance and suspicion. In a palace where every action could be interpreted as ambition, she trained herself to move only when necessary, to speak only when her silence would cause greater harm. She let others take credit for decisions she had shaped. She allowed rivals to rise just far enough to reveal themselves before ensuring their quiet dismissal. She did not rule through fear. She ruled through foresight. And that foresight allowed her to see what the early Qing most needed: continuity. The court could not survive another regency defined by paranoia. The emperor could not be molded by fear alone. What she built was not a puppet monarchy, but a throne with muscle memory, a generation of leaders conditioned to balance power and patience, punishment and ritual, strategy and tradition. But the cost of this design was loneliness. Xiaozhuang's life was filled with victory, but few companions. She buried those closest to her and outlived those who had once questioned her worth. She left no writings of her own, no grand declarations of legacy. Her memory survives in the stability she left behind, in the uninterrupted line of Qing rule that stretched well into the 19th century. She was remembered by Kangxi with deep reverence, but beyond that, her presence faded into the quiet architecture of history. The systems that functioned, the policies that endured, the rulers who reigned without revolt. Some historians regard her as the matriarch of Qing stability, a woman whose maternal guidance ensured the dynasty's survival through its most vulnerable years. Others see her as a manipulator cloaked in mourning robes who controlled men and councils without ever signing her name to policy. Both views contain truth. She ruled through suns and shadows, shaping the dynasty while remaining just outside its official history. She never wore a crown, but she outlived those who did. She never led a campaign, but no battle was more critical than the one she fought within the palace walls. Her life is a reminder that history is not only shaped by the visible thrones and battles, but by the silences behind them, by the hands that guided children into rulers, by the minds that understood power without possessing it outright. Xiaozhuang's legacy was not one of spectacle, but of structure. The Qing dynasty did not rise from conquest alone. It endured because it was built to withstand the weight of time, the pull of identity, and the chaos of transition. And in that design, there was her hand, steady, unseen, and absolute. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?